A secret agreement during World War I carved up the Middle East with lines on a map. And we're still seeing the chaos from that today. The reason your friend from Brazil speaks Portuguese while most of their neighbors speak Spanish, that goes back to a line drawn by the Pope over 500 years ago. Ever wonder why a tiny independent country, Vatican City, sits right in the middle of Rome? A deal with Mussolini made it happen. The very idea that your country is its own boss and other nations can't just barge in and tell it what to do. Well, that's largely thanks to some peace deals signed way back in 1648. And many of the straight-line borders in Africa, often blamed for modern conflicts, were decided at a conference in Germany where no Africans even got a seat at the table. Number 9. The deal with Mussolini that created the world's smallest country inside Rome. You know Vatican City, right? That tiny independent nation plunked right down in the middle of Rome, home to the Pope and St. Peter's Basilica. It's the smallest internationally recognized independent state in the world, both by area and by population. But have you ever wondered how this tiny holy speck became its own country, completely separate from Italy? Well, it wasn't magic. It was a treaty. Specifically, the Lateran Treaty of 1929. For decades before this, things were pretty awkward between the popes and the Italian government. When Italy was unified as a kingdom in the mid-1800s, it took over Rome, which had been under papal rule for centuries. The Pope at the time, Pius IX, was not happy. He declared himself a prisoner in the Vatican and refused to recognize the Kingdom of Italy. This standoff, known as the Roman Question, lasted for nearly 60 years. Popes came and went, but the Vatican still didn't officially acknowledge Italy's existence or its right to Rome. Imagine your neighbor claiming your house isn't really yours while living in one room of it. Enter Benito Mussolini, Italy's fascist leader. In the 1920s, Mussolini, despite his regime's later complicated relationship with the Church, saw a political advantage in resolving the Roman question. He wanted to boost his legitimacy and gain favor with Italy's largely Catholic population. So negotiations began between his government and representatives of Pope Pius XI. On February 11, 1929, they signed the Lateran Treaty. This wasn't just one document, but 3 separate agreements. The first, and most famous, recognized the full sovereignty of the Holy See in the state of Vatican City. It officially created the 109-acre territory as an independent nation. Italy recognized Vatican City as a neutral and inviolable territory. The second part was a concordat, which defined the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Italian state. It made Catholicism the state religion of Italy, though this part was later revised in 1984, making Italy a secular state. It also gave the Church significant influence in areas like marriage and education in Italy. The third part was a financial convention. Italy agreed to pay the Vatican a hefty sum, around 750 million lira in cash and 1 billion lira in state bonds, as compensation for the loss of the Papal States back in the 19th century. So why does this treaty, signed almost a century ago, still matter? Well, for starters, Vatican City exists as we know it entirely because of the Lateran Treaty. It's the reason the Pope is not just a religious leader, but also a head of state. This unique status allows the Vatican to maintain diplomatic relations with over 180 countries, issue its own passports, have its own postal service and euro coins, and operate its own media outlets like Vatican Radio and L'Osservatore Romano. It has permanent observer status at the United Nations, allowing it to participate in international discussions on a wide range of issues, from peace and human rights to development and environmental concerns. all while maintaining its official neutrality. The treaty also ensures the Vatican's financial independence and physical security, provided in part by Italy. The Swiss Guard, with their colorful uniforms, are responsible for the Pope's personal safety, but Italy polices St. Peter's Square. The legal framework established by the treaty continues to govern relations between Italy and the Vatican, covering everything from property ownership to the status of clergy. It's a living document whose effects are seen every day in the heart of Rome and in the Vatican's global diplomatic presence. Number 8. How a meeting in Germany carved up Africa, and why those lines still cause trouble. Ever looked at a map of Africa and noticed all those ruler straight lines that make up the borders between countries? Many of them look like someone just drew them on a map, without much thought for what was actually on the ground. Well, in many cases, that's not too far from the truth. A big part of this story goes back to a meeting in Germany in the late 19th century. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 and the document it produced, the General Act of the Berlin Conference. By the 1880s, European powers were deep into what became known as the scramble for Africa. They were hungry for resources, new markets, and colonial prestige. Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Germany, and others were all staking claims across the African continent, often bumping into each other and risking conflict among themselves. To avoid treading on each other's toes too much, and to make the whole process of colonization more orderly from their perspective, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called a conference in Berlin. Representatives from 14 European nations and the United States attended. Crucially, not a single African leader or representative was invited to this meeting that would decide the fate of their continent. The General Act of the Berlin Conference, signed on February 26, 1885, didn't actually draw all the borders itself. Instead, it laid down the rules of the game for how European powers could claim and control African territory. One key principle was effective occupation. This meant that a European power couldn't just plant a flag and call a territory theirs. They had to establish some kind of administrative presence, like a fort, government office, or police force, to prove they were really in charge. This rule actually accelerated the scramble as nations rushed to put boots on the ground to solidify their claims. The act also declared neutrality for the Congo River Basin, though this area would become the brutally exploitative Congo Free State, personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium, promised free trade in the region and included provisions for suppressing the slave trade. Though forced labor often took its place, it was all very businesslike, dividing up a continent as if it were an uninhabited pie. The long-term impact of these decisions and the subsequent border-drawing frenzy they unleashed, based on European convenience rather than African realities, is still felt very strongly today. Those artificial borders, often drawn straight through existing kingdoms, ethnic groups, and traditional migration routes, lumped together communities with no history of shared governance, and sometimes separated people who saw themselves as one. This has been a major contributing factor to political instability, ethnic tensions, civil wars, and separatist movements in many African countries since they gained independence in the mid-20th century. For example, the borders might cut a single ethnic group into 2 or 3 different countries, making them minorities in each and hindering their collective political power, or force historic rivals into the same national framework. Resource allocation also became a huge issue. Borders were often drawn to secure access to valuable minerals or fertile land for the colonizing power, without regard for local economies or how these resources were traditionally managed. This legacy continues to affect how wealth is, or isn't, distributed and can fuel conflicts over resource control. Furthermore, the administrative systems set up by colonial powers, often favoring certain local groups over others to help them rule, created deep-seated resentments that have persisted. While African nations have been independent for decades, the map shaped by the Berlin Conference and subsequent colonial agreements remains largely intact, and its consequences are a daily reality for millions, influencing everything from national identity to regional security. The Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, even decided early on to generally uphold these colonial borders, fearing that trying to redraw them would lead to even more widespread conflict, a testament to how deeply entrenched these lines had become. Number 7. The Pope drew a line on a map in 1494, and it's why Brazil speaks Portuguese. Why is it that Brazil is this giant Portuguese-speaking island in a sea of Spanish-speaking countries in South America? The answer, believe it or not, goes back more than 500 years to a decision made by the Pope, formalized in something called the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed on June 7, 1494. The Letro is pure age of discovery drama. Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, had just discovered the Americas in 1492. Of course, people were already living there. This kicked off a major rivalry between Spain and Portugal, the two big maritime powers of the day. Both were eager to claim new lands and trade routes, especially routes to the spice-rich Indies. Portugal had been exploring the African coast for decades and was worried Spain would muscle in on its turf. Spain, fresh off Columbus's success, wanted to secure its rights to the new territories he'd found. To prevent these two Catholic kingdoms from going to war over it, Pope Alexander VI stepped in to mediate. In 1493, he issued a papal bull, a type of public decree, that drew an imaginary line down the Atlantic Ocean, from the North Pole to the South Pole, 100 leagues, about 300 to 400 miles, west of the Cape Verde Islands, which were Portuguese. Spain was granted rights to all non-Christian lands to the west of this line, and Portugal got everything to the east. Portuguese weren't entirely happy with this arrangement. They felt the line was too far east and wouldn't give them enough room to maneuver their ships down the African coast en route to India, nor would it give them much claim in any potential new lands in the Atlantic. So they negotiated directly with Spain. The result was the Treaty of Tordesillas. This treaty moved the Pope's line further west to 370 leagues, around 1,185 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the east of this new line would belong to Portugal, and everything to the west to Spain. Neither country really knew what lay on either side of large parts of this line at the time, especially in the yet-to-be fully explored lands of South America. The incredible thing is how this arbitrary line, drawn on a map by diplomats who had only a vague idea of the geography involved, had such a massive and lasting impact. As it turned out, the new Tordesillas line cut through the eastern part of South America. When Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral officially discovered Brazil in 1500, though he may have known of its existence, it fell neatly within the Portuguese zone, defined by the treaty. This is the historical reason why Brazil became a Portuguese colony, distinct from the Spanish colonies that surrounded it. Today, the most obvious legacy of the Treaty of Tordesillas is linguistic. Brazil, with over 200 million people, is the largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world. All its neighbors in South America, except for Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana, primarily speak Spanish. This linguistic difference has shaped Brazil's unique cultural identity, its literature, music, and its relationship with the rest of Latin America. While the treaty itself became largely obsolete as other European powers like Britain, France, and the Netherlands started their own colonial ventures and ignored the Pope's division, its initial effect on the colonization patterns of Spain and Portugal in the New World was profound. It set the stage for the colonial administrations, the economic systems, and the cultural landscapes that developed. Even though the original line was later pushed westward by Portuguese settlers, bandeirantes, venturing far beyond it, the initial claim secured by the Treaty of Tordesillas gave Portugal its crucial foothold in South America, ensuring that a huge chunk of the continent would develop with the Portuguese rather than Spanish. It's a powerful reminder of how decisions made centuries ago, based on limited knowledge and imperial ambitions, can still draw the cultural and linguistic maps we live with today. Number 6. The secret WWI deal between allies that screwed up the Middle East map. Many of the conflicts and a lot of the instability we see in the Middle East today have roots that go surprisingly deep, sometimes back to deals made in smoke-filled rooms during World War I. One of the most able of these was a secret understanding reached in 1916 between Great Britain and France, with Russia's assent known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It was all about carving up the Ottoman Empire, which was allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war was even over. The Ottoman Empire, often called the sick man of Europe by then, had controlled vast territories in the Middle East for centuries, including areas like modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. As WWI raged on, Britain and France started to think about what would happen to these lands if, or when, the Ottomans were defeated. They both had strategic and economic interests in the region. Britain was particularly concerned about protecting routes to India, and France had long-standing commercial and cultural ties, especially in the Levant, the area around modern Syria and Lebanon. So Sir Mark Sykes for Britain and François-Georges Picot for France got together and in secret drew lines on a map. Their agreement, completed in May 1916, divided much of the Ottoman Arab provinces into zones of direct British and French control, or spheres of influence. Generally, Britain was allocated control over a southern zone, including what would become southern Iraq, Mesopotamia, and the ports of Haifa and Acre in modern Israel. France was given control over a northern zone, including southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, including Mosul, Syria and Lebanon. Palestine was designated for international administration because of its religious significance to Christians, Muslims, and Jews, though Britain had its eye on it too. Some areas were designated for an Arab state or confederation of states, but these would still be under British or French influence. The real kicker: this secret deal directly contradicted promises Britain was making to Arab leaders at the same time. Figures like Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, were being encouraged to revolt against Ottoman rule with vague British promises of an independent Arab kingdom after the war, as detailed in the Hussein McMahon correspondence of 1915 to 1916. The Arabs launched their revolt in 1916, playing a significant role in the Allied victory against the Ottomans. When the Bolsheviks took power in Russia in 1917, they found a copy of the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the Russian archives and, to embarrass the Allies, published it. You can imagine the outrage and sense of betrayal among Arab leaders. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, though modified by later events and treaties, like the San Remo Resolution in 1920, which largely confirmed its principles and assigned mandates, became a foundational blueprint for the post-war redrawing of the Middle East map. The borders of many modern Middle Eastern states, like Iraq and Syria, were largely established along lines that reflected British and French interests rather than existing ethnic, tribal, religious, or geographical realities. For instance, the new state of Iraq bundled together Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Kurds, groups with very different histories and identities, under a British-installed monarchy. Syria and Lebanon were carved out by France, separating regions that had historically been more integrated. The legacy of these artificially drawn borders and the broken promises is still profoundly felt. Many historians and political analysts argue that these imposed divisions have fueled decades of resentment, nationalism, and political instability across the region. the arbitrary borders often ignored the traditional settlement patterns and allegiances of local populations, sometimes grouping rival communities together or splitting cohesive groups across different states. This has contributed to internal conflicts, border disputes, and the rise of various political movements, including those seeking to redraw these colonial-era boundaries. Groups like ISIS, for example, explicitly aimed to dismantle the Sykes-Picot borders and establish a caliphate across Iraq and Syria. While it's an oversimplification to blame all the Middle East's problems on Sykes-Picot, this line in the sand, as it's sometimes called, undeniably played a major role in shaping the political landscape and continues to be a symbol of foreign interference and betrayal for many in the Arab world. It's a stark example of how secret diplomacy focused on imperial interests can have devastating and long-lasting consequences for ordinary people. Number 5. You probably think your country runs itself, and these 370-year-old treaties are a big reason why. Ever take it for granted that your country has its own government, makes its own laws, and generally doesn't have other countries telling it what to do within its own borders? That whole idea, the concept of national sovereignty, feels pretty normal now, but it wasn't always the case. A major turning point in establishing this principle was a series of peace treaties signed way back in 1648, collectively known as the Peace of Westphalia. The first half of the 17th century in Europe was a mess of almost constant warfare. The big one was the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, which was fought mostly in Central Europe and involved pretty much all the major European powers. It started as a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants within the Holy Roman Empire, but it quickly snowballed into a massive struggle for political power with dynasties like the Habsburgs, Catholic, and the Bourbons, Catholic France, but allied with Protestant powers to counter the Habsburgs, duking it out. The war was incredibly destructive, leading to widespread famine, disease, and the deaths of millions. Some estimates say up to a third of the population in parts of Germany perished. By the 1640s, everyone was exhausted and broke. Peace negotiations began in the Westphalian towns of Munster and Osnabrück in Germany. These were complex multi-party talks that dragged on for years. Finally, in 1648, several treaties were signed, including the Treaty of Munster and the Treaty of Osnabrück. Together, these are what we call the Peace of Westphalia. So, what did these treaties actually do? Well, a lot of things. They redrew some borders, recognized the independence of Switzerland and the Netherlands, and granted more autonomy to the states within the Holy Roman Empire, weakening the emperor's power. But the most important and lasting outcome, the one that still shapes our world, was the formal establishment of the principle of state sovereignty. This meant that each state, or principality or kingdom, was recognized as sovereign within its own territory. Rulers could determine their state's own official religion, cuius regio, aegis religio, whose realm his religion, though with some protections for religious minorities, and other states were supposed to refrain from interfering in their internal affairs. It was a move away from the idea of a universal Catholic empire and towards a system of independent equal states. Pope's political influence over international affairs was significantly reduced as secular rulers asserted their authority. Peace of Westphalia is often seen as the birth certificate of the modern international system of nation-states. Principles it enshrined: territorial integrity, sovereign equality of states, and non-interference in domestic affairs became the bedrock of international law and diplomacy for centuries. Think about it. When one country invades another today, it's considered a violation of sovereignty, a principle solidified at Westphalia. When countries exchange ambassadors and sign treaties, they are acting as sovereign equals. The entire structure of the United Nations, with its General Assembly, where each member state has a vote, is based on this Westphalian idea of a world composed of distinct sovereign political units. Of course, the Westphalian system hasn't always been perfectly respected. There have been countless wars, invasions, and interventions since 1648. And today, pure Westphalian sovereignty is challenged by things like globalization, international human rights law, which can sometimes justify intervention if a state is committing atrocities against its own people, the responsibility to protect doctrine, powerful international organizations, and non-state actors like multinational corporations or terrorist groups. The fundamental idea that states are the primary actors on the world stage, and that they have authority over what happens within their borders, remains a powerful organizing principle of our world. So the next time you think about your country's independence and its place in the world, remember those exhausted diplomats in Westphalia nearly 4 centuries ago, who, in trying to end a devastating war, accidentally laid the groundwork for how we understand international relations. Number 4. How America got Florida and a chunk of its west because Spain was spread too thin. Sunshine, beaches, theme parks. It feels like an inseparable part of the United States, but it wasn't always that way. For centuries, it was Spanish territory, and the story of how it became American, along with how a big chunk of the U.S. western border with then Spanish Mexico was defined, is wrapped up in a treaty you might not have heard of, the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. In the early 1800s, Spain was having a tough time. Its vast colonial empire in the Americas was crumbling, with many colonies fighting for independence. Florida was a bit of a headache for Spain. It was sparsely populated by Spanish settlers, difficult to govern, and had become a refuge for runaway slaves from the U.S. and a base for Seminole Indians who sometimes raided into Georgia. The United States, meanwhile, was in an expansionist mood. It had already acquired Louisiana from France in 1803 and had its eyes on Florida for several reasons: to stop the cross-border raids, to gain valuable coastline on the Gulf of Mexico, and simply to grow bigger. Tensions were high. American General Andrew Jackson, a bit of a loose cannon, had even led troops into Spanish Florida on a couple of occasions, the First Seminole War, without explicit orders, capturing Spanish forts and basically showing Spain that it couldn't effectively control the territory. Spain, weakened by wars in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars, and independence movements in Latin America, realized it was probably going to lose Florida one way or another. So it decided to negotiate. The negotiations were between U.S. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, that's the Adams part, and Spanish Minister Luis de Onis y González Vara, the Onis part. They haggled for a couple of years. Adams was a tough negotiator. He wanted Florida, but he also wanted to clearly define the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase, pushing the U.S. claim as far west as possible. Onis wanted to get the best deal for Spain, which included trying to get the U.S. to promise not to recognize the rebellious Latin American republics. The treaty, officially titled the Treaty of Amity Settlement and Limits between the United States of America and His Catholic Majesty, was finally signed on February 22, 1819, and ratified in 1821. Under its terms, Spain ceded all of East Florida to the United States, and also gave up its claims to West Florida, parts of which the U.S. had already kind of annexed. In return, the U.S. agreed to pay up to $5 million in claims by American citizens against Spain, so Spain didn't get the money directly, but it settled its debts. Crucially, the U.S. also agreed to renounce its rather flimsy claims to Texas, which at the time was part of Spanish Mexico. This was a big concession, but Adams felt getting Florida and a clear Pacific-facing western border was worth it. The treaty didn't just hand over Florida. it also drew a new, very important boundary line. This line ran from the Gulf of Mexico up the Sabine River, forming part of the modern Texas-Louisiana border, then north and west along various rivers, Red River, Arkansas River, all the way to the 42nd parallel north, the modern Oregon-California border, and then west along that parallel to the Pacific Ocean. This was huge. It gave the U.S. its first recognized claim to territory on the Pacific coast, effectively making it a transcontinental nation, at least on paper. Spain, in return, got its claim to Texas and the lands south and west of this line, like California and New Mexico, solidified, at least in relation to the U.S. The Adams-Onis Treaty's impact today is pretty clear. First, the U.S. got Florida, which is now the third most populous state. The defined boundary with Spanish territory, soon to be independent Mexico, shaped American westward expansion for the next few decades, while the U.S. did later annex Texas and acquire much more territory from Mexico after the Mexican-American War. The Adams-Onis line established important markers. For example, parts of the borders of states like Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and Oregon can trace their origins or definitions back to the lines drawn in this treaty. Disputes over water rights, land ownership, and resource management along these historic boundary rivers, like the Sabine or Red River, sometimes still reference historical treaties and surveys stemming from this era. It was a pivotal moment in consolidating U.S. territory and ambition, all because Spain was overstretched and John Quincy Adams knew how to drive a hard bargain. Number 3, the 300-year-old border deal between Russia and China that still matters today. When you think of major international borders, the one between Russia and China is definitely up there. It's one of the longest land borders in the world. Relations between these two giants have waxed and waned over the centuries, from close allies to bitter rivals. But one of the earliest formal agreements that helped define their relationship, and a significant part of their shared frontier, was the Treaty of Nerchinsk, signed way back on August 27, 1689. This makes it the first treaty between a European power, Russia, and China, then under the Vatican dynasty. In the 17th century, Russia was rapidly expanding eastward across Siberia, seeking furs, resources, and new territories. The Tenzha dynasty in China, relatively new and founded by Manchu invaders, was busy consolidating its power and securing its northern frontiers. As Russian Cossacks and adventurers pushed into the Amur River basin, a fertile region rich in resources and considered part of the Manchu homeland, they inevitably clashed with Adizan forces. There were sieges, skirmishes, and a general state of tension. Both sides realized that continued conflict was costly and that a negotiated settlement would be better. The negotiations took place near the Russian outpost of Nerchinsk. Was a pretty remarkable event for its time. The Russian delegation was led by Fyodor Golovin and the ADR delegation by Song Gotu. What's really interesting is that because neither side spoke the other's language fluently and there wasn't a common diplomatic tongue yet, they relied on Jesuit missionaries who were in China at the time to act as interpreters and mediators. The official text of the treaty was actually written in Latin, along with Russian and Manchu versions. The main point of the Treaty of Nerchinsk was to define the border between the two empires in the Amur region. It established a border along the Argun River, and then northward along the Stanovoy Mountains to the Sea of Okhotsk. Russia had to give up its claims to the Amur River Valley itself, including the fort of Albazin, which had been a flashpoint. In return, Russia gained recognition of its control over the lands to the north and west of this line and secured important trade rights with China. It was in many ways a compromise, though China arguably got the better end of the deal in terms of territory at that specific moment. So why should we care about a treaty that's over 330 years old? For one thing, the Treaty of Nerchinsk established a period of relative peace and stability along this vast border that lasted for about 150 years. It allowed both empires to focus on other concerns. It also set a precedent for how Russia and China would interact diplomatically. Unlike many later treaties China signed with Western powers in the 19th century, the Unquiwal Treaties, Nerchinsk was negotiated, at least on the surface, between two powers that treated each other with a degree of respect as equals, partly because the Adain were strong in each other with a degree, and Russia wasn't yet overwhelmingly powerful in the Far East. The border, defined by Nerchinsk, didn't last forever. In the mid-19th century, when China was weakened by internal rebellions and Western pressure, like the Opium Wars, Russia took advantage and pushed its borders southward to the Amur and Ussuri rivers through new treaties like the Treaty of Agen, 1858, and the Treaty of Peking, 1860. These later treaties are viewed very differently in China, often as part of the century of humiliation. However, the groundwork laid by Nerchinsk still echoes. The modern Sino-Russian border, while mostly based on these later 19th century agreements, still reflects the long history of negotiation and demarcation that began at Nerchinsk. Even in the 20th century, during periods of Sino-Soviet tension, disputes over islands in these border rivers, like Damansky-Zhenbao Island in 1969, brought the two nuclear powers close to war, highlighting the enduring sensitivity of this frontier. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia and China finally settled their remaining border disputes in the early 21st century, often referencing the historical trajectory of these treaties. Today, with Russia and China forging closer strategic ties, their long shared border, whose origins trace back to this 17th century pact, is more a zone of cooperation and trade than conflict, a testament to how far relations have evolved since those early Cossack encounters. Number 2. New Zealand is still debating this treaty, signed in 1840. And here's why. New Zealand, a stunningly beautiful country known for its dramatic landscapes, sheep, and the haka, but beneath the surface, there's an ongoing, often intense, national conversation about its founding document, the Treaty of Waitangi, or Te Tiriti o Waitangi, signed on February 6, 1840. It's not just a dusty old piece of paper, it's a living document whose interpretation and implications are constantly debated and affect many aspects of life in New Zealand today. In the early 19th century, increasing numbers of British settlers, traders, whalers, and missionaries were arriving in New Zealand, which was already inhabited by various Maori tribes. The British government was initially reluctant to formally colonize, but concerns about the welfare of Maori, the behavior of some unruly settlers, and potential rival colonial ambitions, especially from France, pushed them to act. They decided they needed a treaty with Maori chiefs to legitimize British authority. Captain William Hobson was sent as lieutenant governor with the task of negotiating this treaty. The treaty was drafted quickly in English and then translated into Maori by missionary Henry Williams and his son Edward. On February 6, 1840, at Waitangi in the Bay of Islands, Hobson and about 40 Maori chiefs signed it. Over the following months, copies of the treaty, mostly the Maori version, were taken around the country, and eventually over 500 chiefs signed. Here's where it gets really complicated and why the treaty is still so contentious. The English and Maori versions are not exact translations of each other, and the differences are hugely significant, especially around key concepts like sovereignty and land ownership. In the English version, Article Y states that the Maori chiefs cede to Her Majesty the Queen of England absolutely and without reservation all the rights and powers of sovereignty over their territories. However, in the Maori version, the word used for sovereignty was Kawanatanga, which many Maori understood as governance, a system of laws and government, like the British governor would have, but not necessarily meaning they were giving up their fundamental thanga. Article 2 is also crucial. The English version guarantees to Maori the full, exclusive, and undisturbed possession of their lands and estates, forests, fisheries, and other properties, so long as it is their wish and desire to retain the same in their possession. It also establishes the Crown's exclusive right of preemption, meaning if Maori wanted to sell land, they had to sell it to the Crown first. The Maori version of Article 2 guarantees Tino Rangatiratanga over their wenua, lands, kanga, villages, and taonga katoa, all treasured things, which can include intangible things like language and culture. Tino Rangatiratanga is often interpreted as meaning something like absolute sovereignty, self-determination, or chieftainship, seemingly contradicting the cession of sovereignty in Article Y, or at least the British understanding of it. So did Maori cede sovereignty or just the right to govern while retaining their own authority? Did they agree to sell land only to the Crown, and under what terms? These differing interpretations, based on the different texts, lie at the heart of nearly 2 centuries of grievance and debate. For many years after 1840, the English version of the treaty was emphasized by the colonial government, and many of its protections for Maori were ignored. Vast amounts of Maori land were acquired by the Crown and settlers, often through dubious means, including outright confiscation after the New Zealand Wars of the mid-19th century. Maori society suffered greatly, with loss of land leading to economic marginalization, population decline, and erosion of their traditional way of life. The impact today is profound. Since the 1970s, there has been a major resurgence of Maori activism and a push for the treaty to be honored. In 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was established. This permanent commission of inquiry makes recommendations on claims brought by Maori relating to breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi by the Crown. It has investigated hundreds of claims covering everything from land alienation and resource rights, like fisheries and forests, to the protection of Maori language and culture. These investigations have led to significant settlements with various iwi, sometimes involving financial compensation, return of land, or formal apologies from the Crown. The Treaty of Waitangi is now widely considered New Zealand's founding document, and there's a growing effort to understand its principles, often summarized as partnership, participation, and protection, and apply them to modern governance. This influences everything from healthcare and education policy to environmental management and broadcasting. It's a constant negotiation about how two peoples, Maori and Pakeha, New Zealanders of European descent, can live together and share power in a way that respects the promises made, or understood to be made, back in 1840. The debates about co-governance, constitutional reform, and the meaning of Tino Rangatiratanga and Kalanatanga in the 21st century show that this nearly 200-year-old treaty is anything but forgotten. It's at the very heart of New Zealand's identity and future. Number 1. The treaty that ended a war and gave America, California, Nevada, Utah, and more. Ever look at a map of the United States and wonder how that whole southwestern part from California to Texas became American? A huge piece of that puzzle was put in place by one single treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848. This treaty didn't just end the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. It resulted in Mexico ceding over half of its territory to the United States. That's right, more than 500,000 square miles of land changed hands. The war itself was controversial, driven by American ideas of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand across the North American continent, and sparked by disputes over the border of newly annexed Texas. After a series of U.S. military victories, including the capture of Mexico City, Mexico had little choice but to negotiate. The talks took place in the town of Guadalupe Hidalgo, just outside Mexico City. Nicholas Trist, an American diplomat who had actually been recalled by President Polk, but decided to stay and negotiate anyway, a story in itself, represented the U.S. The terms of the treaty were pretty stark for Mexico. Under Article the 5th, Mexico formally ceded a massive amount of territory. This included California, Nevada, and Utah, as well as parts of what are now Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. This area was known as the Mexican Cession. Mexico also gave up its claims to Texas and recognized the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. In return for this enormous land transfer, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million, about $500 million in today's money, and to assume about $3,250,000 in debts owed by the Mexican government to U.S. citizens. Some historians see this payment as conscience money or a way to make the annexation look less like pure conquest. Treaty wasn't just about land and money. Articles the 8th and IX included important provisions concerning the Mexican citizens who would now find themselves living in U.S. territory, around 80,000 to 100,000 people. They were given the option to either move south into what remained of Mexico or stay and become U.S. citizens. Those who stayed were, according to the treaty, to be maintained and protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty and property, and secured in the free exercise of their religion without restriction. Their property rights, including large land grants often dating back to Spanish colonial times, were supposed to be honored by the U.S. government. The impacts of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on the United States today are almost immeasurable. The most obvious is the sheer size and shape of the country. Think of the economic powerhouses of California and Texas, the natural resources, the major cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Denver, and Phoenix, all on land acquired through this treaty, or in Texas's case, whose annexation was confirmed by it. The discovery of gold in California just days before the treaty was signed, though news spread after, triggered the California Gold Rush, massively accelerating westward migration and development. However, the legacy for those of Mexican descent in the ceded territories is more complex. While the treaty promised protection of property rights, many Mexican landowners found it incredibly difficult to prove their titles in U.S. courts, which operated under different legal systems and languages. Over subsequent decades, many lost their lands through legal battles, fraud, or economic pressure. This loss of land had profound economic and social consequences for generations. The promise of full citizenship rights also took time to be fully realized, with discrimination and unequal treatment being common experiences. Today, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo continues to be a significant reference point in discussions about Mexican-American identity, civil rights, land rights, and the history of the U.S. Southwest. It's a reminder of the deep historical ties between the U.S. and Mexico and the complex ways in which borders and national identities are formed. Issues surrounding immigration, border enforcement, and the cultural heritage of the Southwest are all shadowed by this 175-year-old agreement. It shaped not just the physical map of the United States, but also its demographic makeup and the ongoing story of its diverse peoples. So the next time you're enjoying the California sunshine or admiring the Grand Canyon, remember the forgotten treaty that made it part of the USA.